Alrighty. Okay. Ooh, that's too loud. Went too far. Okay. Welcome again. Okay. Blah. Friday. So, hello again. There's less of you here than there were on Wednesday. As always is the case. Every class. My SOC 100 was the same. All right. So, obviously today we're starting kind of a new topic. We're going to talk about Canadian employment trends and labor force participation. So we're going to go through those two subjects probably in the next couple of classes, and we're going to then just kind of keep moving through the course. We're a little bit behind on what I had on the syllabus, but that's fine because some of these units are considerably shorter than, say, the unit on concepts and theories. So, all good. Obviously, new Slido for today in this class. So I haven't quite tabulated it because I'm still working through the short answers. I saw some variability, but mostly I would say on the multiple choice, the average was kind of between 24 and 28. So that was pretty, standard. 24, 28 out of 30, right? That was sort of in the standard range. And then there was a few, that got 30 out of 30, and a few that were below, into the teens, and a couple into, the mid-teens. So, but not very many, right? So mostly in that kind of 78 to 80% range was sort of where I saw things for the most part. So far, the short answers look pretty good, but I have, I've only done maybe 10 out of the 130. Yeah.
If the average for the first midterm is high, will the second midterm be made much harder?
Maybe. I don't know. Probably not, right? I suspect the average will balance out. Classes this size, the averages just kind of tend to sort of fall into the range that the department tells me I need, or the Faculty of Arts tells me I need to have. And because you're in a 300 level class, we can push as high as like a kind of low B plus in terms of the class average without anybody getting too offended or questioning me. So, and generally I've found that I don't need to play around with averages or anything. But I saw enough variability in terms of the multiple choice that my suspicion is it'll be fine. But yeah, I probably won't make it. Oh, would you like it to be harder?
No.
Okay. No, I can make it a lot harder. No, just because of the time constraint too. There's only so much we can do to kind of make things harder. Like I could ask much harder short answer questions, but I doubt that'll be necessary. And generally, I don't do that. So, any other questions? I mean, I'm going to try to get you the grades before the end of reading week, optimistically. I'm going to try to do it as fast as possible. These are pretty quick to mark, so probably a couple of hours, maybe I would guess about 5 hours of work for me to mark the short answer in this class. So I'm hoping to work through it pretty quickly and get you your grades. And then obviously, once the grades are back, if you want to come and review, look over the exam, we can easily make arrangements to do that. And I will try to get that done as quickly as possible, so that we have lots of time to review before the second midterm. Okay. Good, other than that? I don't know, Friday. And now it's the furthest time from the next midterm, so it's far away in our minds. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Canadian labor force, what it kind of looks like, its composition, some of the trends, and also things like statistics and labor force participation and what it all kind of means. Okay, so I guess my first slide. Broadly speaking, which I've been informed by one of my other classes is a phrase that I overuse, but whatever. Canada's workforce is aging. It is composed in large part of two generational cohorts. The baby boomers, those born roughly 1946 to 1960, we'll say 62, depends on who you ask. So the oldest of this cohort, of course, is aging into their kind of late 70s at this point. So most of them are retired, and even the younger, cohort is now starting to reach retirement age. And then Generation X, or Gen X, born roughly 1963 to 1979. So these are our two kind of biggest cohorts. The boomers, for lots of reasons that maybe don't bear speaking about at this point, they're a kind of demographic anomaly. If we talk about Canada in this period, between 1946 and 1962, is something like 8.7 million children were born. So it's a massive demographic, right? Okay, so what does this mean? Well, we have an aging workforce. A lot of people, are now tending towards retirement, with relatively few younger workers to come in and take their place. Because the next two generational cohorts, the millennials, born roughly 1980 to 95, and Gen Z, born roughly 1996 to about, let's say, 2010. Both of these are very small demographic cohorts. So amongst other things, the boomers and Gen X had relatively few children, meaning that the subsequent generational cohorts are relatively small. Okay, so what does this mean? There's a lot of sort of challenges to an aging population, especially in a country like Canada that has a couple of structures that require, that are basically predicated on a workforce that kind of looks like this, right? Where the bulk of your workforce would be at the bottom of the pyramid, and then you would have a smaller cohorts, at the top. What the Canadian workforce actually looks like, and forgive my terrible art, is kind of like this, and then narrowing as it gets towards the bottom. So it's disproportionately in that older section. Okay, so when we talk about the implications of an older workforce, well, for younger people, genuinely, an older workforce, and especially one that's composed largely of baby boomers in Canada, tends to mean one thing, job opportunities. As these folks retire, they're going to need to be replaced. And that replacement, there's going to be a lot of jobs and possibly lots of good paying jobs, and not a lot of workers. So in some sense, if we think about supply and demand in the labor force, lots of job openings, few workers is going to tend to mean, good bargaining opportunity. Now, I have a friend teaches plumbing at NAIT, and his estimate for plumbers, right? So this is a trade and a skilled one, is that basically for every one new plumber, roughly 7 people retire, right? So that the plumbing industry in Alberta is losing, for every one new plumber they train, you're losing 7 people to retirement. And what he's found is that genuinely, young people going into this market are in the driver's seat, right? They're commanding really good salaries. They have a lot of job mobility, and they have a lot of ability to, demand concessions from employers because there's relatively few of them around. So job opportunities, lots. So pensions, and I'll put that one in green. So pensions, there's a lot of interesting problems with pensions. Generally speaking, when we talk about pensions, both at a kind of government level and at an organizational level, the idea of organizations offering pensions, which was largely predicated on the idea that there would always be more young workers than pensioners, right? And pension systems sort of emerged at a time where, the average life expectancy was, somewhere between 65 and 70. And you would have expected that, retiring at, say, age 60 or 61, you would have had, between 4 and maybe 10 years of pension. Now, our average lifespan is creeping up into the high 70s. However, lots of people are living into their 80s and 90s, right? My grandma lived to be 99 years old. And I think my wife's grandfather lived to be 96. So what does this mean? Well, it means that you have a lot of people staying on pensions for a very long time. When, say, the Canada Pension Plan was envisioned, right, we all pay into CPP as soon as we start working, there was roughly 1 retiree for every 10 workers. Today, that ratio is somewhere between 1 in 2 and 1 in 3, right? So for every 1 pensioner, there's 3 workers, which means you need to this person to pay a lot more to support that person, right? Or those 2 people, or those 3 people. So that's at like a government level. For organizations that offer pensions, the situation is the same. We often have fewer workers working today to support, per pensioner to support. And a lot of pensions were basically built on this system of, shall we call it a sort of pyramid scheme? Because the initial generations that got in had never paid into pension, their pensions were being paid by the current workers with the idea that, the current workers' pensions would be paid by future workers. And it hasn't quite worked out. So lots of retirement schemes are looking at being insolvent in a couple of decades. Social Security in the US, they say probably will become insolvent roughly around 2030. The Canada Pension Plan, or CPP, is in slightly better shape. We think about 2050, unless it gets reformed. And the Conservatives under Stephen Harper tried to reform it by raising the retirement age to 67, but when the Trudeau Liberals came in, they promptly dropped it back to 65, compounding this problem. Okay, so the chances that you will get a pension, either from the government or from an employer, are considerably smaller than they would have been for your parents. Okay, so pensions are an issue. All right. Purple. Work values. One of the things that's happened in workplaces, and this has probably been most notable with millennials, is sort of gaps in work values. Although we're definitely seeing it with Gen Z as well. And I can tell you a story of this in a second, where, today probably the workforce is dominated by baby boomers and Gen X. And they have, especially in upper management, and they have a certain set of values. Like if we think of the values the baby boomers had, You know, a lot of it was working really, really hard when you were younger, you know, putting in extra long hours, never seeing your children, and then reaping the rewards for that once you hit kind of middle age and you're kind of near retirement years, right? This is my father and my father-in-law, like my dad. He went to a job all day and then he ran his own business in the evening. And he worked on average between 70 and 80 hours a week for most of the time I was a kid, right? But then by the time he hit about 50, you know, he was able to scale back a lot of things. He quit his main job and just worked at his kind of side job until he retired at age 62. But he put in these really long hours, right? Socked money away in the stock market and all this crap. You know, didn't see him that much at times, but whatever. My wife's dad was the same, right? He was off working on oil rigs as a petroleum engineer. Most of the time she was a kid, you know, putting in weeks that were 80 to 100 hours sometimes. And then as he got older, right, reaped the rewards. And you see kind of similar things with Gen X. What happened with the millennials and then what's happening with Gen Z is something a little bit different. Millennials came into the workplace right around the kind of early 2000s, right? So like 2000 to 2005 is when you get that first kind of wave of millennials coming into the labor market. And they had a different set of values because they'd seen their parents work themselves into diabetes and cardiac arrest or heart conditions at young ages. And so what did millennials want? They wanted, you know, what was called, and I remember this, work-life balance. Okay. And this created a sort of, and I can tell you because I lived through this, this caused a kind of clash with especially the baby boomers in the workplace who are like, no, you pay your dues, you get your work-life balance later towards middle age. But the millennials were like, no, we want work-life balance right now. We saw what that did to y'all, and it was no fun. And so it created a sort of clash in work values. Now, Gen Z has been an interesting case too, because a lot of the employers that Gen Z is dealing with are Gen X. And one of the things that's been really important to Gen Z so far, and I say this because we were interviewing for a position at the CCR for a project coordinator, right? And we interviewed probably about 15 to 20 people, and almost all of them were Gen Z, and all of them wanted to work from home, right? All of them, almost. Like one of the most common questions was, how many days can I work from home at this job? Or do I have to come into the office to do this job? And in our case, the answer was no, but we didn't hire any of them anyway. Because my boss, who's Gen X, and German, I don't know if that matters, it might, was like, yeah, I don't like this question. This is a weird value, right? You come into work, you do your job if you're asked to come in. So, weird, there's a lot of different kind of work values in play, and they're clashing in the workplace, and especially around things like work from home. And you see this now, like with the Canadian Civil Service, right? A lot of the people that came in, you know, and are kind of younger millennial or Gen Z are kind of frustrated that they can't work from home, that they're being asked to return to the office. Organizational structures, you know, kind of related to work values. A lot of them are designed around a very traditional kind of progression through the workplace, you know, which doesn't always suit people. People don't always want to say start at like a very base level and work their way up and, you know, climb the corporate ladder, but the corporate ladder is still designed in the same way. And economic growth, it kind of, you know, two ways to think about this. Potentially for Gen Z workers especially, there's a lot, because most of millennials have been in the marketplace for a long time and Gen Z is still just kind of coming in. There's a lot of potential as the boomers retire, but there's a lot of questions around economic growth, especially in the West, and how sustainable it's going to be, and what this might mean for Gen Z coming into the workplace, right? So the aging workforce could do two things. The aging workforce could put a drag on the economy, right? As they retire and they start collecting their pensions, and one of the weird things that people do is they spend less. As you get older, you spend less, right? So this could potentially put a drag on the economy and kind of slow things down substantially. Or, you know, and here's one where people are talking about this. It hasn't happened yet. Because like I said, these guys are, the oldest of them is about, what, 78? Or 78, 79? They're calling it the Great Transfer. As all the wealth that the baby boomers accumulated during their life, when they die, is getting transferred down to mostly the millennials, right? Some Gen X and millennials. And this itself, you know, people are suggesting could create a huge economic boom, because suddenly, you know, well, I can imagine how much money I will get when my parents die. I don't want to, but I can. It's a lot, right? My parents own significant real estate holdings. They have a lot of money stocked away from working 70, 80 hours a week when I was a kid. And the amount of money that's going to be passed down generationally is going to be probably one of the biggest transfers in history. So that could easily spur economic growth, you know, as these generations that have been a little bit economically not suppressed, but maybe haven't done as well economically as their older peers, suddenly get a big transfer of cash. So there's lots of possibilities, you know, in terms of economic growth. It could slow down, which obviously is going to be bad for younger workers, or we could see a huge boom. Okay. I'm going to erase this. Okay, and I'll erase this. I like it. I'm using my other laptop with the pen that has an eraser on the back, and this is kind of nice. Okay, so the baby boom generation, right, I talked about them already, especially at, you know, when they were kind of in their prime, and when Gen X was trying to get into the marketplace. One of the things that happened with Gen X and the older millennials, was that they faced a lot of challenges getting into the workplace, especially moving up, because there were less opportunities for younger workers. The boomers were such a huge cohort that they sort of soaked up all the jobs and stayed there for a long time. And the boomers themselves, a lot of them found that they plateaued, right? That there were so many of them competing for upper management positions, right, at like the top of the workplace, like the C-suite positions at the top, they sort of got stuck. Okay. So, let me just, okay, I've gorfed that up. Let me fix it and change this again. Wow, that one slide took like 20 minutes. Okay. Sometimes I think I'm not good at my job, or I just have too many things to say. Okay, let's go through this one really quickly. So, as with the aging of the workforce, one of the things that happened, right, is you typically have this kind of like pyramid in most organizations, right, with very few positions at the C-suite, you know, and then kind of upper management, fewer positions, some in middle management, and then a lot of employees at the base. What's happened with aging, and especially as, you know, the baby boomers now age out of the marketplace, is there is fierce competition for these positions at the top of the pyramid, right? There's a lot of potential, but also a lot of people that got stuck here for a long time waiting for the boomers to retire that are now waiting for their chance. Okay. Generally speaking, young people as a proportion of the workforce, and I'll show you graphs of it in a sec here, have declined over the past 3 decades. So you have a lot of middle-aged people, right? A lot of people, you know, say between, I'm going to say 30-year-olds are middle-aged, no one's going to like me for that, but say between like 30 and 50, kind of in the workforce, and that's a much larger percentage than it was in the past. You know, I talked about this on the last one, safety nets, pensions, healthcare. Oh my gosh, healthcare is in really deep trouble. We keep the baby boomers alive for too long, which I'm grateful for because they're my parents. But you know, the medical system and this kind of free Medicare that we have in Canada is going to become more and more problematic as our population gets older, right? The increase in healthcare costs and the strains on a shrinking young workforce to pay for it, right? Because the money for that healthcare system comes from your taxes and mine. Well, my taxes. I don't know how much you pay in taxes. I pay much more. Trump almost had me for a second when he was like, if you became part of America, you'd pay lower taxes. And I look at my tax bill and I'm like, yes, I would pay lower taxes. And then I realize I don't want to be an American, and everything kind of goes back into focus. But we pay a lot of taxes in Canada. It's wild. Yeah, he almost had me at lower taxes, but not quite. Okay. So, age distribution of the labor force by gender our first one here is 1976. So you look at the blue. The blue is 1976. The gray is 2018. Why are you buzzing? I think I have to put this thing in do not disturb. People keep texting me. How do I put my phone in do not disturb? There it is. Okay. My son is sick, and he's like, I need more time on Fortnite. I'm like, no, go sleep. Stop. Okay. So what do we see? So we've got men, right? If we go back to 1976, these two parts of the labor force were fairly large, right? You had a pretty large, 14% of your labor force. Actually, all three of these were much larger than they are today. 9.7% was, 15 to 19-year-olds. 14% was 20 to 24-year-olds, and 26.9% was 25 to 34-year-olds, right? So you're relatively young workers. And as you went from there, these lines got a lot smaller, right? Basically, your 44 or 45 to 54-year-olds, that was a smaller group. Your 35 to 44-year-olds, your 45 to 54-year-olds, and your 55 to 64-year-olds were all much smaller groups. And even your 65 plus, was a smaller group than it is today. So what we've seen is this part of the labor force all shrink, right? These are our young workers. And our older part of the workforce, right, middle age and, to elderly, all get considerably bigger among men. Okay, it looks even more dramatic, when we look at women. Now, there is something to be said here that older women did participate in the labor force a little bit less because of historical conditions in the 70s. But you see how big, how big all of these have gotten compared to how big they were in the past. And what you have there is an image of an aging labor force, that is dominated by older workers who are at some point going to retire, and that's going to leave a lot of labor disruptions. It already is, right? We're already seeing the beginnings of this. So, Canada, being the resourceful country that it is, has long sort of tried to solve this problem through immigration. And immigration has long been a part of the Canadian story, right? Really since the beginning, and before Canada was even a country. Okay, so if we look at Canada, right, a couple of things that are notable. So Canada tends to take in the highest proportion of immigrants in the G7. About 20% of somewhere between 20 and 25% of our population is foreign born as of 2021. I couldn't find fresher numbers than 2021. So about 20.6% of our population is foreign born. Okay, now why this has, okay, so if we look at the chart, right, the kind of estimates is that by 2036, this is going to jump to about 30% of the population. So a really large number of people in Canada are going to have been born outside of the country. Now, why is this necessary? Well, in basic terms, and I think I've talked to you about total fertility at some point already. I can't remember. I have lots of classes. Total fertility rate, or TFR, is a basic measure of kind of how many children people are having, and whether you're going to be able to replace your population. So total fertility rate is measured in children per woman in your fertile range, which is about 15 to 44, right? So in this range of women 15 to 44, how many children do you expect them to have in their lifetime? Okay, so I know it's a weird kind of number, but it's the way demographers calculate the fertility rate. So in order to keep your population from declining, you require, in a modern country with modern medicine, relatively low maternal and infant mortality, you require a total fertility rate of about 2.1 children per woman. The last time Canada had a total fertility rate of 2.1 children per woman was 1971. So if Canada had no immigration, basically our population would go kind of like down and down and down until eventually the Americans could just walk in and there'd be no one to oppose them because there'd be no one here. The average, so total fertility is, every year they change the measurement. If you want to talk averages in the last 10 years for Canada, it's about 1.6 children per woman. But in the last year, right, in 2023, that number had declined to an estimate of 1.33 children per woman. So Canada, and this is actually happening virtually all over the world, total fertility is dropping really rapidly. Now, we're not as bad as South Korea, where South Korea has a total fertility rate of something like 0.73, really, really low, which means that, if there's no immigration or no change in the birth rate in Korea or South Korea, eventually the North, we can just walk in. There won't be any South Koreans left to stop them, and they can just take over the country. Not that North Korea is doing that much better, as far as we know, because they don't publish statistics. So, okay, pretty low fertility, right? And this is true of most Western economies. So Canada, because of the kind of place it is, has generally solved this through immigration. And it's allowed Canada to, I guess, arrest some of these problems. However, Canada has also faced a bunch of problems with its economic growth in general. Okay, one thing I'll say, almost any kind of economic system, right, whether that's liberal, neoliberal, Keynesian, or Austrian, we won't talk about the Marxists because their economic system is a little different, all of them are basically predicated on growth, that the economy should be growing over time. That's how you measure increased prosperity. But this has always been predicated on the notion of countries having growing populations. And no one exactly knows what's going to happen if and when, and it's probably more a question of when at this point than if, the population of major economies starts to shrink. So the first one's going to be Japan, which hit a dubious distinction in 2015. One of my favorite statistics coming out of Japan from 2015 is that 2015 was the year that they sold more adult diapers than baby diapers. A measure that tells you that, things are not going well. And for South Korea, in 2024, there were more 83-year-olds in South Korea than there were 1-year-olds. So these are probably the first economies you're going to see whether you can keep an economy growing with a shrinking population. Okay, Canada has managed to keep its population growing through immigration, but that itself comes with a few problems. So Canada, really until about 2015, had a very particular immigration system that prized high-skilled workers. And there was a point system. So depending on your occupation, you got points. So this worked pretty well for Canada up until about 2015. But from 2015 on, Canada changed its system, particularly for kind of low-skilled workers. And they started bringing people in as temporary foreign workers to work low-skilled jobs. Things like, working at Tim Hortons, McDonald's, driving for Uber, or whatever, low-skill job you can think. And this has led to a big population spike, but a spike of low-skill, low-wage workers for the most part, some of whom have been allowed to file for permanent residency. So that means you brought in a lot of workers, but a lot of workers that are relatively unproductive. Okay. Anything else to say about this? Trying to think if there's anything else interesting. We'll talk temporary foreign workers again later. It's a pretty gross program that the UN Special Envoy on economics compared to a system of modern day slavery. But we can talk about that later. Okay. Can the guy at the back of the class please be quiet? That would be great. I can also hear you. Yes. Okay. We have no one likes you, guy at the back. Everyone wants you to be quiet. Okay. What do you think government jobs or the pension is the primary reason a lot of people do the job will do to handle the aging problem? Okay. This is a really interesting question because yes, a lot of public sector jobs have, these big promised pensions, and how to put this diplomatically? There's really no way. So what's going to end up happening to a lot of these positions is because these pensions are they're essentially guaranteed, right? They're part of the employment contract. So one of two things is going to happen. Either the government is going to pass legislation that amounts to a big pulsing middle finger to all the public sector workers that earn pensions and says, we're not going to pay you anymore, or we're going to pay you at a reduced rate because we're bankrupt. Or a lot of these programs are going to go bankrupt probably sometime in the 2030s or 40s because they're not going to have enough workers to pay their outlays. And then the government is going to have to sweep in to bail them out. And this has already happened to some extent. The pension fund for the public school teachers in Alberta required a big bailout from the provincial government once already, basically because it had overspent and overpromised, and the damn teachers are living too long, right? Teaching is a really, I was going to say a stupid profession. That's not quite what I meant. The way that pensions are structured for teachers is really, really, really dumb. And it's something that's going to cause endless problems. I'm going to go back because I'm going to tell you how this formula works. If you can get a teaching job, it's awesome. Because basically, most teachers are aiming for what's called the 85, which is you get basically a pension equaling 85% of your salary when you're retired. And that's calculated as your age plus your years of service, right? So every year that you keep teaching, you gain 2 years on this kind of pension, this pension formula. And most people kind of stop at 85 for whatever reason, because it's like, are you going to keep working for that extra, 7 years for that extra 15% of your salary? And most people say no, right? But this obviously, if you've, let's say you've worked for 30 years and you're 55, you've got your 85%, right? So a lot of teachers, my mom did this. Damn sponge on the system. No, I'm kidding. I love my mom, but she retired at 55. She's now 72. And, given average life expectancy for women in Canada, let's say she's going to live until she's 85. That's 35 years of pension from the teacher's fund, right? It's a long time to be on a pension, where she's getting 85% of the salary she earned when she was a teacher. So all those kinds of plans, and I know the professors at the U of A have a guaranteed pension. I have no idea how it works because I've never bothered to look into it, possibly because my plan is I don't think it's going to exist by the time I retire, so I'm just saving money for myself. So I'm like, I don't care how it works. I also don't think old age security and pensions are going to work. Yeah, I don't know how the professors one work. I was anticipating your question. I should probably look into it. I'm too young to think about retirement. Okay. So I think a lot of these government programs is going to be like the government goes in and dumps money into it, probably by printing money or taking on debt, or they restructure it so they pay only a portion of it because the program gets too expensive. Did I spend more time with my dad once he reduced his hours? Well, by that time I was like in university, so probably less, to be honest, but that's okay. My childhood pain is not your problem. Cats in the cradle and the silver spoon. No, I'm kidding. That's a very 70s reference. I'm sorry. Okay, has the amount of jobs available to work has the amount of jobs available to work be part of the reason age distribution of the labor force is on average getting older. Okay, the biggest part of it is there's just fewer younger workers, right? That's the biggest part of it. So the workforce keeps aging, and there's not enough young workers to come in. Okay, I will say, sorry, because I want to talk immigration again. One of the other problems that we've had with our immigration system in Canada is that we get workers that are usually somewhere, around 30. That's kind of average, 30 to 34 for average age for people immigrating to Canada to work. But then what they do, we have a family reunification system. They tend to bring mom and dad over. And then you add people that are in their 60s, into the Canadian population, who then also try to find a job. So it sort of like screws up any advantages you would have gotten from the immigration system. So what happens when you spend too much time reading labor statistics? You know all this random stuff. Okay, how am I doing for time? Oh, so terribly bad. I'm like, I got through 9 slides in 50 minutes. No, we're doing okay. Okay, so immigration, right, where Canada used to get its immigrants, right, basically from, we'll say 1867, because we'll talk about Canada as an actual country, until probably the 1970s, was mostly from Western Europe, right? Western Europe, particularly the British Isles and Germany and France, were the preferred kind of locations that the Canadian government said they wanted immigrants to come from. Obviously, you got a lot of people from Eastern Europe and Ukraine. Ukraine, Poland were the big ones. Some from Russia. This kind of dried up after I guess 1917, when the Soviet Union sort of locks down big chunks of Eastern Europe, and especially after 1945, when the USSR really locks down Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. There's some uptick in Eastern European immigration, especially from, let's say, like Poland, the former Soviet Union, to Canada after the collapse of the USSR in 1991, but still, doesn't really make up for the needs that the country has. So, Europe really stabilizes after around 1970, right? Most of the post-war damage is fixed, and Western Europe is very prosperous. So European immigration to Canada and the US really slows down. So right around that same time, Canada adopts an official policy of multiculturalism and starts to take more immigrants from different places, right? So today, where we see the bulk of our immigration is from East and Southeast Asia, right? China and the Philippines contribute a lot. Probably our top source of immigration today is from India. Just makes sense. It has a massive population, lots of skilled and talented people that want to move over. And this obviously has increased. Every time I walk in front of there, I get a blast of light right in my eyes. It's super fun. Blinds me for a second. We've seen a huge increase in diversity in the workplace. And I think I have this on the next slide, but I'll say it anyway. Most major metropolitan areas in Canada today are about 50% visible minority, right? That's especially true of Toronto and Vancouver, but increasingly true of Calgary and Edmonton as well. Okay, and Montreal too. We can count Montreal, right? Okay. So obviously, we've had changing immigration policies. A lot of Canadians will treat this as we became more enlightened and we started welcoming people from all over the world. I'm more cynical, and I will say we only did that and embraced ideas like multiculturalism because we had to, because I actually don't believe that our political elites are that enlightened, but that's just me. I think multiculturalism is a good thing, but I also think it was adopted cynically. We did it because we had to, right? Because no one wanted to come from Europe, and they're like, oh, if we're going to keep growing our population, we need immigrants from other places. Let's adopt multiculturalism. We see a lot of demand, obviously, from Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and increasingly, and this is going to be more true the further we go forward, from Africa. Africa I think today has close to 2 billion people, and by the end of the century, that is probably going to jump to about 4.5 billion people. So there's going to be a lot of people that want to immigrate to Canada from Africa. Yeah, obviously lower demand to emigrate from Europe, and our temporary foreign worker program bringing in low-skilled workers to work in low-skilled industries like fast food. Fast food and retail are dominated in lots of ways now by temporary foreign workers. Okay. 4 minutes. Okay. Generally speaking, our two groups are younger than the average of the Canadian population: immigrants and Indigenous people. Now, Indigenous are way younger, like considerably younger, and immigrants are just a little bit younger. There's also kind of weird disparities. The skew for immigrants is something like 60-30, male to female. So we have a lot more immigrant males than immigrant females for whatever reason. Okay, yeah, in our biggest centers, right? So Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, the GTA, and Montreal, and to some extent Halifax, visible minorities are now about half the population, or more, right? I think there's some argument to be made that Vancouver is now majority minority, right? There is no single kind of racial minority in the Vancouver region. Okay, so making up a bigger part of the workforce, especially as older and predominantly white Canadians retire. Obviously, I think you can imagine how this poses certain problems, in the workforce in terms of workforce diversity, and I think that's why we've seen programs like DEI, right, or the U of A's version of it, ACB. What is it? Access, Community, and Belonging. I think they should have just gone with ABC, but that's okay. Right, as we try to accommodate and figure out how to work and give opportunities to diverse people in the workplace. So we need to promote more diversity. Okay, so generally speaking, this also presents a couple of issues. One of the things that's true of a lot of the baby boomers is they're pretty well educated, same with Gen X, and our kind of immigrant and Indigenous populations on the whole tend to be, especially with the TFW program for immigrant workers, on the whole tend to be a little bit less educated, meaning that there's a skills mismatch often between what companies need and what is actually available in the labor market. Okay, 49, 48, 49? What does cell phone standard time says? Cell phone standard time says 49. I don't think I have time to do another slide, so let's pick up from Rising Education on Monday. And we'll keep going. I think we'll get through all of this on Monday. It'll be fun. I'll try not to get stuck for 24 minutes on a single slide. Oh yeah. Okay, maybe Wednesday. Okay, we'll see you next week. Have a great weekend.